Hello everyone, I'm Rika, lead level designer at Ubisoft Singapore. Today I'm here to share with you all what I've learned over the past few years while working on building the world and locations in the recent title of the Assassin's Creed game franchise. You may wonder what a level designer is about. So think of us as like architect in a virtual game world. We create and design levels based on research and references. And we work closely with the level artist and mission designer to build the thematic flavor and narrative of what the region and world has to offer. In the present, I'm leading the Assassin's Creed Valhalla world design team in Singapore and also mentoring level designer from Ubisoft Studio, Philippine and Chengdu, who are also working on this upcoming installment of the Assassin's Creed franchise. These are the few titles I've worked on since I started at Ubisoft Singapore. I'll be adapting example mainly from Assassin's Creed Odyssey for today's presentation. So here's an overview of the three topics I'll be talking about: the fundamental, the technique, and the iteration process. In order to understand and how to go about designing a good level, we want to start from the basics, studying and learning the fundamentals. If you think about it, it's like growing the plant seeds and having the roots deeply rooted underneath the soil, getting all the nutrients from Mother Nature. After you learn and understand the fundamental, you will think about methods to go about applying those knowledge and utilizing those principles. It's basically applying and figuring out the best technique to grow the plant in the most efficient and proper way you deem best of at that moment. Then comes the iteration process where you further develop and improve the level. So now you have a grown plant. The question is, how could you make its living condition even better so it can grow bigger and produce fruits afterwards? But also at the same time, we need to make sure that we don't overdo it. Otherwise, the plant might die in the end. In the first session, I'll be going through some of the few principles that I've worked with, and it also helped me to understand and define what is a good level. The level should be easy to read, fun to navigate. It should also hint and teach the player, and also at the same time provide opportunity that can potentially challenge and surprise the player too. And since we are also creating the level as part of a world where player will spend hours exploring, we should also make it relatable and engaging. These are also some of the things that most of the level designer out there are applying in their work as well. When the level is designed to be easy to read through the guidance of visual language, such as the usage of geometry shapes, color, and metric assets kit, it prompts the player to explore and navigate the level easily. And adding in some gameplay ingredients to help create some interesting momentum along the way, it will make it fun to go from one point to the other. So here's an example of one of the fort that I did in AC Odyssey. We have a secret entrance at over here, and then we have a treasure location which is on the other end that is supposed to be our main objective. And then along the way, we have some stalking bushes, which is our main stealth ingredient that we have been using in most of our games. And then we do have like ingredients that prompt you to go forward, such as the ladders, the rope, and the zip line. So with all these ingredients and architecture structure set in this playground, we can sort of control and lead the player to where we intend them to go. So let's add some enemies in this location as well. And for example, if the player is coming through the secret entrance, he managed to locate it from the outside. What he could do is that he basically got funneled into this stalking bushes over here, where he will encounter his first enemy, which is walking left and right around this area. And he can't possibly go up all the way to this building to actually use the rope. So what he could do is basically use this building over here instead, go into it, use it as a cover, get to the higher ground. And from there, he can actually see the next objective, which is going to this building over here. And afterwards, what happened is that from here, he could actually see the rope already that will lead him to the highest ground in this entire location. And of course, he will definitely go forward, or he could choose to explore the interior of the building that he was in over here as well to get some collectible and stuff. And then after he reached the higher ground over here, he will see that there's a zip line here that he can use it to get across to finally reach where the treasure is, which is right at this end over here. And if you look at how all the ingredients are being placed, it's kind of overlapping with one another in terms of like the different options and paths the players can take. And eventually, if you think about it, whenever he came from, he can very well use all the different other ingredients to get back to where he started. So that is one of the things that we play around with when we deal with like this kind of gameplay location in our world. How we go about hinting and teaching the player? We shouldn't provide too much, as it would turn out to be us hand-holding the player safely through the level. But at the same time, also not too little as well, because that may very well confuse your player and make them frustrated. We should also provide key information such as the setting, context, and the gameplay mechanics through many different ways. In the most explicit manner, it should be able to catch the attention of the player immediately the moment he steps inside of the level. So for example here, we have this crowd of people gathering around, and there are like NPCs speaking to one another as well. So this is something that will catch the player immediately, and then we have like this quest marker as well. So that's something definitely one of the things that we can do. And also like props, favor text, or even architecture structures that shows like what this level is about and what the player is going to expect from it. And in the most simplest way of also guiding the player, we use this tapestry to sort of guide player from one point to the other. So the thing is that the player can always refer back to this to orientate themselves and find his way again if he happens to get lost within the level. And another example here we have is that like the schedule and position of enemies could also be one of the things that we can show what the player can possibly take advantage of as well. So instead of the player going through all these stairs, climbing down the ladder to just get to the underground area of this location, what he could do is that he can just practically assassinate that guy to go down straight. It's like a shortcut basically. While there are explicit manners of teaching the player what to do and expect in a level, there's also the implicit manner where we provide necessary gameplay ingredients and opportunity that is being placed within the level for the player to take advantage of, without actually telling him about it in details. And it is up to the player choice to take on which elements that fits his playstyle and mood at that point of time. So in the first image over here, we have routes that indicates that there might be something more than what it seems. If you explore further, you may find a secret entrance. And there is also different options and action player can take from a safe distance, blending from one point to another, or even transition from one area to another, providing various shortcuts that the player can take advantage of without facing the encounter heads on. So in this case, we have a military location over here, and this is the main entrance. And over here we have a sort of like a secret entrance which we have provide a route that you can parkour through all these buildings down and eventually reach it. And then we also have the usage of common ingredient like our stalking bushes to get them to where we want them to go, which is not really on like the obvious main route path over here. And in this way, we can also sort of guide the player to the higher ground, which is generally safer. And sometimes, depending on the progression of where your level is being introduced at, it could change a lot on what you know the player can do by then, and from there, determine what could be the best few ways player can go about consuming and playing your level. But what is an interesting level without a bunch of challenges and surprises? As the player progresses through the level, or even from one location to another, we need to ensure that he is encountering something different, which will continuously pique his interest to continue onwards. It could be like tweaking the difficulty as the level goes along, an introduction of a boss fight at the end of the level, or to navigate through spaces which require the player to figure out the right way. Also putting challenges in fighting enemies in tight spaces, yet still respecting the combat space matrices, or discovering a location with various forms of challenge of enemy archetype as the player venture deeper. Oh yeah, it's always interesting and fun to add in tiny bits of surprises that player will never be expected to find or encounter in the world. At the same time, it shouldn't be too out of place within the level itself. So for this example, we have a look-alike Bali Resort vibe gameplay location, featuring one of the factions in Odyssey, the Daughter of Artemis, represented by the statue over here. And how we go about making it not so out of place is to basically blend the location, using the vegetation and how we grow alongside with the trees of the forest. In a way, it's like a box of surprises player can chance upon if he happens to venture deeper into this forest. While I design my level, I always imagine the different scenario that the player could engage himself in, and how I can help in bringing him the best experience, as though he is actually working through the location and interact with the different elements it has to offer. This is especially important when we are leading them through the narrative that goes through the level, and also the different choices he could make, and how the level itself could impact and affect his decision making during those times as well. Set dressing, crowd life, the different architecture structure, how we go about designing each space to invoke different kind of emotion, or even how different kind of events are triggered based on condition. So here is the Murex dyeing facility. Murex dye is considered to be very valuable during that time period. It's the main economy driving this region. Thus, a huge area is being catered for it over here. Civilians are working on dyeing the cloth in the foreground. And in the middle, we have people harvesting the murex stems to be extracted for the dye. And towards just the left of it, there are piles of extracted snails being discarded. And at the back, you can see the cloth that are already being dyed are hung out to dry. We also have this small little corner here where they pack and fold up the cloth to be eventually shipped off through the docks to the other part of the world for sales and trade. So there's like this whole process going around in just one single area. And over here, we have a location to sort of prepare the civilian and players to fight a big boss. You can see some people are preparing by dueling with each other, and then we also have a blacksmith to forge your weapon. It's probably a good idea to get yourself fully armed before you actually go out for a big fight. And then there are like just some people just taking a good rest before the big fight ahead and just chilling over there. And then we also have like this island that is very famous for the Battle Royal quest line, Melos, where the framing of the crowd life and the people have gathered around this area prompt you to go forward and take on the challenge. There are also people who came to the island to bet on warriors that they reckon to be the last one standing. And you can very well see it being reflected in the region, along with the warriors preparing for the big battle against one another. So that's it for the first section. And in the next section, I'll be diving a little deeper on the techniques that we use in planning and creating our world regions and location in Assassin's Creed, alongside with the fundamental that we already went through beforehand. So here are the 5 ways how we go about creating each of our location in Assassin's Creed. Designing the space. From working on the regional level to planning out which location goes where based on the research and geographical references, to planning out the individual location. Level designer need to identify what kind of space each location should have and work toward building up how each space should feel like. And let's dive a little bit deeper into the individual location. So we will take a look at Lato City, which is like the main city for this entire region. In Lato City, we make sure that each space should be easily distinguishable from one another, while paying attention to architectural sense and the logic of the world. Props are sometimes being added to serve parkour gameplay purposes. And then we also have like visual props that focus on showcasing intention to better support the spatial design and at the same time avoid cluttering. Less is always more. And you will gradually realize that well-designed spaces are more memorable to the player and help them to orientate themselves better. So during this phase, we also design a bunch of 2D layout based on references. And this is probably the nicer one that you have seen so far. And at the same time, we come up with different and unique gameplay one-liner ideas if we are looking at like gameplay location, such as a collectible place of interest, POI, or a military location, for example, over here. During this time, we also often go back and forth the engine to work with existing assets if there's any, to create simple blockout based on the layout in order to test and make sure that the spaces are being designed as how we intended them to function. As because like architecture kit works differently and we have to see how our layout could match up with them. Sometimes the space that we gauge in the 2D format, it might be either bigger or smaller in the 3D world. So this is something that we have to double check on. And if there's no existing assets in the world that exists for us to use, we usually go to 3D Max to create Lego blocks that we can play around with, mesh up a layout in the 3D world later on, and then we will have the architecture artist come in later to help us build up the kits for that. So now with all the space in place, we can identify the flows where the player is intended to travel within the region, within the level itself. And usually for bit location or bit region per se, those are the area where the crowd NPC will travel along as well. So if the spaces and flows are well designed, the player should be able to experience a present sense of transiting from space to space. On a region level, we could plan out on how each of the location will prompt player to explore the next through the narrative and or world thematic. So for example in Kaitira, a region that promotes religious tourism, we will have basically the player following the flow of the pilgrimage that these tourists will go through in this region. So religious tourists will come to Kaitira, build boats and ship docking at the harbor over here. And then by the harbor, there's also a tavern for the tourists to rest after a long journey before they head into the main city, which is over at the center over here. So they can just rest, chew, eat some food before continuing the journey. So after the tourists relax in a tavern, they can also like sort of visit the marketplace in the city. There's also a guest house for tourists to stay or eat in within the walls of the city. And if they prefer, for lodging wise, over the night, the tourists can choose to stay close to the temple, where the tents are set up within the remains of rune structure just nearby the temple. The rich pilgrims will stay in the rich section of the pilgrim tents, and while the poor stays on the opposite end of the main road. You can see there's like this vast difference between these two locations, and they are just side by side with one another right over here. And from the tents, the pilgrim will start following the route to the main temple, which worshipped Aphrodite. And note that it can also be done on a location level, following the similar flow from one area to another as well. So this is not entirely just locked onto a regional level. Use of space and silhouette. Learning how to use the space and creating different kind of silhouette helps the player orientation and encourage player to take the intended flow. So for this part, I feel that there's a lot of different ways that we can go about doing it. And these are just some of the few examples that we usually use. So in this case, we have this arc silhouette over here. It is to frame the intended flow and direct the player to the next action step from a narrative moment. And we also use it to funnel player through tight spaces by making use of architectural or natural structure. And like you can see in this case, we are using the cliffs here to funnel the player directly into this foggy area ahead. Or we could have a silhouette that totally stand out from afar and draw the attention of the player. Sometimes this could also make the location feels unique as compared to the other location within the same area too. The idea is to work out the beat shapes first, and the details can come later once the intention are set. So the landmark serve as a point of reference for the player to allow them to understand the layout and sort of orientate themselves when lost. So naturally it could be something very prominent on the high ground or just stood out from afar. Whether is it like a man-made structure or what the natural has to offer. So in this image we have the Minotaur statue. This is our reach high point where player can actually go and climb onto it to synchronize to unlock information for the nearby POIs. So you can sort of see this statue pretty much from everywhere in the region, unless you're hiding behind big cliffs or like you're in between valleys or cliffs itself. So yep, we have made this super epic just for that purpose. So here's a battleground where you will be fighting against a bunch of warrior for the last one standing position. Naturally, you will be bashing your way through, chasing and fighting the enemies, or even fleeing from them when low health. And you wouldn't really notice where you are going. So we have this super iconic landmark, the mountain, on the backdrop to serve as a guide to reorientate yourself. And it also sort of serve as a location where you were likely to fight the few remaining enemies too. And in the foreground over here, we have also this dead tree with hanging corpse serving as a starting area landmark. And notice how the green and lively tree around the surrounding is actually making it pop out even more so that the player will remember it. And the case where it doesn't feel out of place, as once again, it's also thanks to how our level artist and biome artist helps in blending the ground texture, the rocks surrounding the area, as well as the props nicely together. So we also use a mix of natural and man-made objects that stood out in city, like this, which could be a very iconic and striking landmark as well. And just look at how we use the trees at this site to sort of frame the pathway towards the tree on the higher ground. So this is some of the technique that we use to highlight certain things within the location. And by using that, we could actually help the player in orienting themselves. At the same time, creating these memorable moments where the player will remember, oh, there was like this very grand tree like in the center of the city. So like if I found it, I know that I'm at the center and I can reorientate myself to go to my next objective. To further improve on the transiting of space, we design with composition in mind. We identify the foreground, the midground, and the background, after which we build upon them to ease the transition. A good composition setup also helps to create layering and depth to the scene. And here we have Gotham City, which is famous for its law code, which is the wall over here. And then in the foreground, we have civilian, framing up to the midground where the law code is. And then at the same time, in the background, we have a temple on the left and a leader house on the right. And at the same time, also providing the different ways and the different location that the player can go about consuming this location. And we also do like plan routes in terms of parkour navigation or the proper route that civilians actually takes to go up all the way to the temple itself. And along the way, you might find the leader house entrance as well. So everything just sort of like work around with all these elements in mind. So basically, if you think about it, when we already have the foreground, midground, and the background, we know like where's our point A, point B, and point C. So we are basically just sort of like connecting the dots together through routes, navigation path, to sort of link up everything nicely together in one single location. Another example is where we got a foreground of crowd looking up at the sky with a quest marker in the midground. And if you happens to take the quest, the next location that it will actually leads you to is actually already framed in the background, which is this military fort over here. So this is something that we work closely with the mission designer as well as the level artist to make sure that we are taking advantage of the different elements that exist within the world to help us craft a very good composition like this. And at the same time, it is also being used to help guide the player from one location to the other. And that's the end of the second section of the presentation. So in this final section, I will be imparting some learnings from the iteration process on improving and polishing the game and eventually shipping the game. Production tips. Learn and work efficiently with tools and assets. So as you familiarize yourself with the engine and also the tools that it has to offer, gradually you will get used to them and come out with the best way to work around them. It definitely takes time to explore and deep dive into the engine, but the exchanging of knowledge with one another could help in a way as well. Understanding the tech limitation is also a key to work your design alongside with it. It may sometimes be a bit restrictive, but if you think about it, this will actually remove a bunch of issues you may have to deal with as you already foresee it down the road. Let's take Excel for example. This is something that I've been using it these days thanks to my project manager. So in Excel, we understand that like they do have like functions and also like formulas to help us do our calculation without us having to like manually calculate one by one. Like imagine you have like 100 overs of data and you have to add them up one by one. That's gonna take a lot of time. And you could just very well make use of Excel, input all the numbers, select that whole column, function it, formula it, and you will get the amount of data that you need. And in this way, this save up so much time and also make your workflow much more efficient. And then if you think about it, coming back to like making use of engine, I believe like each different engine offer different types of tools and scripts that you can play around with. And making use of them could very well help you save a lot of time. So just take your time and explore with it and see what you can do with them. And at the same time, for Assassin's Creed, we have a library of game asset that we can tap on to help us craft our world. Unique assets are always challenging to create, especially if it is just going to be used once. At perhaps maybe, like, let's say, worst case scenario, a location that is not highlighted in the golden path at all. While taking advantage of what already existed to create something interesting by combining the different props or architecture kit together, we also explore the modular and procedural method of creating the different assets and content. In this way, it will make our life much easier and we will be able to work much more efficiently. Prioritization of the areas along the golden path. So how we do it is basically we separate out our location into the ranking of gold, silver, and bronze. Gold locations refer to those super important location that the player is highly likely to go to, and they are sort of like usually along the golden path, where the story narrative or event will lead them to. So, for example, let's just use back criteria. It is exactly like how we lead the player through the pilgrimage journey of the tourist in criteria, which is sort of like the this white line over here. This is the golden path. All of those locations mentioned are mostly goal location. Some of those locations that are less important but still sort of along the golden path may sometimes be considered as silver location too. That will also include some locations that will introduce certain new feature or content that we want to highlight as well. And for bronze location, they're usually locations that are just mainly created for world exploration. Most of the time, they are much further away from the golden path. Maybe, for example, it could be somewhere here, or somewhere here, or could be entirely over here as well. And through this prioritization, we can determine the amount of work and effort required for each of them. And in this way, this can also help us in managing the workload too. For the last point, so it's understandable how we sometimes will consider our work as our precious baby, especially with the amount of hard work and effort we have put in to make our level the best as it could be. I just want to like improve on top of what already have been done. And even if there are issues and all, I will just keep patching it up and trying to fix it. But what if whatever I have done that I think it is actually fun and engaging for the player is actually conflicting with the direction, the core pillar, or even the tech and the feature of the game itself? Those are the time when I have to make a decision to strike a balance and work out a solution. And in all the worst case scenario, if ever, is probably to destroy everything and rebuild them. Especially in cases whereby I have patched and tried to fix all the growing issues, but all these fixes that I have done will actually create even more problems for me. And based on some of the experience I had and seen, sometimes it's really just much cleaner and faster to start from a blank state again and build the level from there. And the thing is that like you already know what works and what doesn't work. So in the second time, you will definitely try to avoid the same mistake again. This process could be tiring for some people, but I feel that we should still be proud of like what we have achieved at the end of the day, even though the road is not as smooth sailing as we imagine it to be. We learn from it and adapt our past learning to what we are doing now to improve our own workflow and at the same time make it as efficiently as possible for ourselves. And that's pretty much it for the presentation today. Here is the entire outline of what we have gone through today. I apologize that is so full of words. I will definitely try a way to format this better next time. And this is basically from what we have talked about from fundamentals of what makes a good level design to the different techniques that we use to design our world and location in Assassin's Creed. And finally, some learnings after going through the few production cycle and the iteration process. I hope this presentation will provide you with some insights on how we go about building our world and locations. And perhaps this is also something that you could also apply to the games you're currently developing as well. And I firmly believe that going back to the basics and refreshing what you have learned before is a great idea. And from there, look at what you could possibly improve and readapting those into the stuff that you have been working on. Learning is a constant cycle, and exchanging knowledge with one another is one of the key things we always do over in Ubisoft. And this doesn't just apply to level design, but also your field of expertise as well. So, thank you very much for your time, everyone. And I apologize for like the amount of like words that I'm putting in. I know it's a bit heavy, but um do always try to see if you can refer to the recording. So maybe along the way I will come up with like a better way to frame all this up together. So I'm also like trying to improve on how I basically sort of present like all these points together in a tighter format that I can also share it with my fellow level designer too. So, yep, if there's an update, I will definitely keep you guys in touch. Thank you.
But yes, we are open to questions now. But I guess just while people are typing, I did want to quickly ask how much is their feedback and response influence your design from playtesters to you?
So in a few cycles of our production, in order to see like sort of like whether like the things, the level that we build in, like alongside with the quest, does it make sense, or like like what we could possibly improve on. We do actually take in quite a bit of like the feedbacks from the playtester, especially we have like all the sort of like I would say like maybe like a few months, like maybe 2 to 3 months, like after a production cycle, we will have this play test session. We have a dedicated team to work on that, and they usually compile like a lot of like data reports, like what do they feel about the game, or like specific section that we want to find out more about the different parts that we do, whether do they understand like this part of like the level, or like certain features that we also want to test within the level itself. Does it make sense to them, or like what we could possibly work around with? So like all those things, like each of the playtest session is basically we have an objective to meet in terms of like whether is it feature testing, whether is it like just the workflow, the quest flow, the narrative flow, does it make sense to the player? Is it engaging and fun enough? Or like does it appeal to the player as well? Like all those sorts of things. So yeah, we do it on like a 2 to 3 months sort of basis, and we have a dedicated team to send us like a very detailed reports, like in terms of like where the player goes, like the heat map basically as well. So like all those information, we actually take into account when we are planning like our golden path, and also like us determining the effort of like where we should put in more to, like in terms of like the different locations, where are the locations that the player would tend to go, and from there we will distribute our effort upon them. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Just to provide another question while we're seeing anybody else wants to type up any other questions. How often does arguments happen? I'm kind of curious to hear how much does it clash in terms of design and developers and programmers and everything else?
Actually, it's not really so much, because like I always sort of tell my level designer to probably we can sync up with like the game design, the GPP, the gameplay programmer first, like on the things that we can actually do and not do, because we wanted to have like this workflow of not hacking anything together, because it will come back biting us at some point, because like game being too buggy or some sort of things like that. And yeah, because of that, we always check in with like the game designer, the GPP first, and to see like how we can all work together to come up with something really awesome. And that is not through hacking, but through the proper route, proper way.
That's very enlightening. Thank you. So we do have a question from Chris Lee. Any tips on making linear progression look less linear? Or provide more depth to linear progression, I guess.
Oh, okay. So I hope that I will answer this correctly. Usually when we have like point A to point B, kind of like within the location, in terms of like getting from point A to point B, B is like the end objective. It is kind of like a linear progression in a way. And along the way, like we try to provide the different option that the player can take. Let's just say like opportunities. Maybe like you can talk to this specific person to get like some hints or like some clues that maybe like you could discover a secret entrance in the midway to the speed, or like you could just self-discover it yourself, or maybe like you need to find someone in sort of like a house, a tavern, get some information, or like maybe you just like scout around, explore, and then you find something that can eventually lead you to be. So like something like this could work. It's just like maybe providing different variety of options and opportunities for the player to take on, like to sort of like hint and use the word to sort of guide them towards it. Like it could be through like crowd life, or like even just like props itself. So I hope that answers the questions.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. Chris, you can let us know if you meant something else, but we'll quickly move on to the next question from Jeremy, asking, when it comes to designing for more standalone levels versus a more open world exploration, how does your approach different?
I guess let's see.
No problem. Take your time thinking. But I guess is that something you tend to experience in Assassin's Creed, as I guess the most recent ones? They're a bit more open world, right? So would you say that you tend to do more open world designing in terms of your role?
I'm actually looking more on like the overall of the world. Like the individual locations are being worked by the level designer I'm managing. So I feel that there is like, when it comes to different in terms of like maybe like what players can see like within the location itself, compared to like the more of the open world exploration location, because it's more on a large scale level. And for like standalone levels, I feel that like it's a bit more tighter, and like you have just like a specific set of area to work with. So you are constrained by that space. And then for open world, it's really like you can come from anywhere and you need to cater for all grounds. But for location, even though like, when you enter into this location, because it is in a specific area, like even when we do our 360 approach, like you can control where the player can come from by providing the specific options, like maybe a secret entrance at this specific site. And then like once you have that specific area, player discover it, and then you can work your flow within the location from that. And how you could like crisscross and overlap the few different routes within the area based on like how the player enter the location in. But for open world, it's a bit like open, I would say, because like player can come from everywhere, and for Assassin's Creed, in a way, like everywhere is climbable now. So Like this is something that we give player the freedom of, but at the same time, in open world, we also need to sort of have like this similarity to like piece up some paths, some routes for them to take on. But the thing is that like we can't control them where to go, so they will still like ultimately just like go everywhere and might not take the route that we set in path for them in the open world. But for a standalone location, it is much controllable. Like you can block things off, you can make certain parts unclimbable, and so on and so forth. So I guess that is kind of like one of the differences in a way, in terms of like how player approach like the different locations and like the open world differently.
Okay, well, thank you for your answer, and we hope that answered your question, Jeremy. Next question is Sally, who asks about, in terms of working with narrative designers, do you get to give feedback on the story and narrative after you design the levels, or how closely do you work with them on your work?
So there are some instances whereby the world actually is ahead of like the quest sometimes, and naturally like it's our job to sync up closely with the narrative designer and the quest designer to see like how they could like leverage on like some of the existing location we have already done. And it's basically to sort of like strike a balance and negotiation, and for us level designers to sell our location to them to use it. So, but I would say in the best case scenario, at times when like the world and the quest come together, like we really work very closely with them in terms of like what kind of set dressing they want for a location, how to make like this very epic scene pops at this moment, so that like like it will create this very memorable and engaging moment for the players. So yeah, we work super closely with them, and we do sometimes like provide feedbacks on like the story, the narrative, but it's more from like a world perspective view, like the logic flow, like maybe from a walk on top, for example, like if this area go from this area, like what do they need? If they are going on a horse, like the world, they shouldn't be going through like this up down hill, like those sort of things in a way. So it's more from like providing feedbacks in terms of like coming from a world logic perspective.
Thank you for your answer. And we do have a very closely question fits very much in the world of narrative design, which is how closely in terms of design between narrative and level design. For example, will there be generic levels in hand and that you're sort of the narrative designer will modify and fit to form the narrative, or are basically levels created from scratch to fit the narrative? If that makes sense.
So I experience in a way like these two different types, and it's also depending on like the periods of like when the quest is coming from. And sometimes like most of the time we will try to take on existing locations and work from there, because like set dressing an existing location is much easier than creating a location from scratch again, unless it is something like really small, like maybe like an in-between location of like bigger locations. So like those kind of like small set dressing setup, that is manageable as well. We do usually do some of those also, like in the middle of the forest, like those sort of things, or like just like maybe somewhere that might require like a small cave or like a small opening or sort. So like those are the things that if the quest need those kind of location to bridge the gap from one end to the other, we was on the world side we will usually support it.
I see. So, well, thank you. Yeah. I hope that answers your question, Allison.
Yeah.
Feel free to provide more questions and comments on how we answer. I will say, early in the presentation, you mentioned about having framings or the way you frame a level to sort of direct the player. What's the difference when it comes to gray boxing from, let's say, a level in general for the player to move across versus when you're trying to frame the next objective? Is there a difference in how you approach gray boxing those levels?
It's the both same foundation. The most important key thing is that we always try to, like when we do this kind of like composition and framing, we always put ourselves in the player perspective. So it's like the third person perspective. And then from there we see from his view, what will he be saying? What is the distance and what is the foreground, midground and background as well. So like in terms of like gray boxing, this is something that we sort of like, I would say we are lacking a little bit right now, which is also something that we want to try to bring it back, because we are just piecing like existing assets, or like even like we have like Lego blocks already available for us to like, mesh level up together. So everything is sort of like, I would say prefixed in a way. So we only get to play around with like all those things. And through them, in a way, it saves us quite a bit of time to build a level from scratch. And from there, we just like work in the engine to play from the player's perspective, to see how we can experiment with the different framing, at what different camera angle he will be looking at, the different ingredients that he can use, and so on. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Have you experienced designing for first person, and how does it compare to designing for that third person?
Yeah, so I guess that is something that like I feel that I can gain a little bit more experience on, especially moving ahead, because for what I have been working on is just like, since from the very beginning of time when I joined Ubisoft Singapore, I've been working on the Assassin's Creed brand for quite a bit. So it's always like on the third person experience. But for the first person experience, I would say like it will be quite I feel that it would definitely be something different, and it's something that like, I would love to try in the future. And perhaps I will be able to tell you what's the difference then.
But then for now, I think something you said earlier that I think was really good was putting yourself in the player's shoes. It's just not simply looking on a top-down design, but from the player's perspective. Because
the thing is that like one thing that why we always after we do up a layout on the 2D layout, like we always like, just jump into the engine to start piecing something out to see like if our 2D layout actually works. And then from there, I emphasize to like most of the level designer out there to know that like when you are testing your level or whatsoever, just always make sure like, just play it from a character perspective and not zoom out the level to see like, if the space is alright or whatsoever. Because the thing is that like the players out there is going to be playing as the player, climbing your level, walking around your level. It needs to feel like comfortable, or like even just fighting within like a space, it also need to feel comfortable. Is the camera like okay? And or like when you're fighting, is the movement, is it too abrupt, like maybe the ground height are not even, that kind of thing. Like all of these things, like it needs to be tested in the engine because you can't see all this on the 2D layout. So blending is the first step, but like the actual work is actually in the 3D environment.
Okay, well, perfect. I think that's a fitting end to our monthly gathering for this month. Thank you, Rika, again for preparing a presentation for us and for spending the time to do Q&A.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, and we'll see everybody next month. Bye.
Yeah. See you.